This week on The Record, Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner digs in to defend herself against the push to be expelled from office, why some progressive Democrats want a candidate to rise and challenge her in next year's primary. Plus, meet the Republican running against Andrew Bailey for Attorney General in 2024. Attorney Will Scharf is on the record. And in banks we trust, but just how much? The government seizes two banks as customers panic and demand their money. What drove those banks to fail? And can Congress keep the cost of covering that insurance from hitting your pocketbook? Senator Josh Hawley and Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski are on the record. And what's behind the push to ban discussions of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Missouri medical schools? Representative LaKeySha Bosley is on the record. It's all coming up right now. Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. The high-profile court case over the career and the future of Kim Gardner, it basically amounts to an impeachment proceeding. If Republican Attorney General Andrew Bailey is successful in his endeavor, his former boss, Mike Parson, would anoint her replacement. She kicked off her legal defense this week in court, arguing that even if everything the Attorney General says is true, it still wouldn't meet the legal standard of willful neglect of her duties. Earlier this week, we spoke to a former assistant circuit attorney who worked in Gardner's office, Pat Hamaker. He calls himself a progressive Democrat, and some of his allies in the city want to see him run against her next year. Pat Hamaker is on the record. Do you want to see Kim Gardner removed from office?
I believe in the laws, that we have them for a reason. I have a rough understanding of the quo warranto process that's going on. I know it's been previously utilized. I'm going to wait to see how the system goes out. In general, I believe in free and fair elections, and I do recognize that Ms. Gardner has been elected twice by the city of St. Louis.
Let me ask it another way. Do you think voters of St. Louis would be satisfied with a Republican governor picking their circuit attorney?
I don't see it as much of a concern, specifically when you look at Governor Parson's comments that he would be in communication with our mayor, Tashara Jones, here in the city of St. Louis.
Would you accept that nomination if he asked you to do it?
Oh, I haven't even thought that far away.
Would you consider running in 24?
So I just had a child about a week and a day ago, so my focus is on my newborn son and his mother for the foreseeable future.
But there are some Democrats who would like to see you run, or have any urged you to do so?
People have been talking to me. Right now, I'm here to talk about solutions in that office. I'm not going to focus on what Ms. Gardner has or has not done. All I know is that there are real prosecutors with real trial experience who are willing to help, and Ms. Gardner needs to ask for this help.
We've asked the circuit attorney for interviews several times. We've been rebuffed or rejected several times. Can you give us any insight into her thinking as to why she would refuse to accept these resources? What was the response to you when you offered assistance?
So I haven't gotten a response from the circuit attorney's office. I can't speculate on to what Ms. Gardner's thinking. I think it is a real leader will recognize when things aren't going right, admit those mistakes, be transparent about them, and then seek help. All I'm asking is Ms. Gardner do that right now.
It sounds like you're saying there is still a pathway to actual progress, functionality in that office, whether she's removed or faces the voters in 2 years. No matter that outcome, it sounds like you're saying there are steps she can take now, and if she doesn't take them between now and the election, should someone challenge her?
I would agree with that. I think that there's steps that she could take. I've laid those steps out. I think she needs to take immediate action to do it. I'm very concerned about the trajectory of that office. I have been for a while.
And you worked there while she was the circuit attorney?
Yes,
for a short period of time?
Yes, I worked there for a year under her.
While you answered to her, what was your understanding of her perception of outside legal forces, other people who might be in it? Does she have a trust deficit with those people that are trying to offer help?
My understanding would be that would be part of it. You know, I was there in her first term, so I didn't have a whole lot of interaction one-on-one with her. I interacted with her more during the campaign. I will say, you know, she does have a tendency, I think, to put blame on other people and not take accountability for herself. Like I said, I think one of the strong traits of a leader is admitting their mistakes and asking for help when it is, and I'm here offering my help.
And just for anyone of Kim Gardner's supporters, or anyone who might be looking at their potential options, who says, wait a minute, are you being a political opportunist now that the headlines are really bad for her? Suddenly you're vocal. What would you say to a person who has those concerns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will say that, after I left, I was quiet for a long time. I wanted Miss Gardner to succeed. I think that office is vitally important to the city of St. Louis. After the election in 2020, I felt an obligation to speak up and talk about what I perceive some of the issues in that office and really the lack of any progress. I consider myself a progressive prosecutor, so I don't think that this is philosophical issues. I just think that Ms. Gardner doesn't have the experience, the leadership, the organization to run this office effectively.
And you said now partly because Judge Tier just left. Can you describe just briefly before we let you go to our audience what that meant when he left the institution?
It's a devastating loss to that office. Judge Tier is a respected attorney and judge in the legal community here. He brings a lot of experience that I think would help a very inexperienced office. He brings a lot of credibility to the courtroom, so when you're talking about the relationships with the judges, it's a huge loss. You talk about the caseload that he takes on, and now you're talking about 4, maybe 5 prosecutors who handle violent crime in the city of St. Louis. That is just not sustainable.
Could you vote for Kim Gardner again?
No.
Do you think she could win re-election?
I'm not a political consultant who would be able to answer that question. I hope that the voters are paying attention. I think that they are. I think Ms. Gardner needs to be more accountable to the people of the city of St. Louis.
Sounds safe to say you hope someone challenges her.
We'll see. I believe that somebody will be challenging her, for sure.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
That was our interview with Pat Hamaker earlier this week, while Attorney General Andrew Bailey pushes to press Kim Gardner on her record, perhaps expel her from her job. Another Republican is running for the job that Bailey holds now. Will Scharf worked as an assistant U.S. attorney some time ago in the Violent Crimes Division, and a political action committee backing your bid is already drawing some big checks. A lot of it looks like you might be winning the fundraising primary right now. Thanks for joining us on the record.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. It's great to be here while the rest of the state is watching Mizzou basketball win in March Madness. So.
Yeah, well, we have a built-in excuse if the ratings decline today. I think it's the least productive day in any American workplace, and that's to be expected. We hope Mizzou does well. Would you accept an appointment from Mike Parson to work as the St. Louis Circuit Attorney?
I don't live in the city of St. Louis, so I don't believe I'm eligible. But the problems in the Circuit Attorney's office are profound. They affect not just this city, but the entire region and really the entire state. And unless we solve the crime problem here in St. Louis and Kansas City and Springfield and the rest of the state, I think this state and this region really don't have a bright future. So it's something that needs to get done.
I'm glad you raised eligibility. Some people wondered, for example, if the Attorney General or the Governor appointed special prosecutors, they wouldn't necessarily have to fit those residency requirements. We don't know about the appointment from the Governor. Perhaps they would. But the statutory burden for the Attorney General to meet here is willful neglect. Have you seen evidence so far of that willful neglect from Kim Gardner?
I think Kim Gardner should have lost her bar license and been removed from office years ago. I think on the back of the Greitens investigation alone, where she suborned perjury, I think Kim should have gone. More importantly, though, I think this is a problem that's been allowed to simmer by our political elites in Jefferson City and by state leadership for far too long. St. Louis was the murder capital of America before Kim Gardner came into office. The crime problems in this city are profound, and they affect all of us.
But she can make the case, can she not, that her office suffers from staffing shortages, that sometimes judges, police, other evidence, all of that comes into play, and that her intent was to do her job.
I think the buck stops with the boss, ultimately. And in her case, right now in the city of St. Louis, if you commit a murder, your chances of serving prison time for that murder are probably less than 1 in 4. That's an unacceptable situation. It's an untenable situation. And it's a driver of a lot of the problems we've seen in this city in terms of drawing economic development, drawing investment, just drawing people into the city.
A news report that covered your announcement, your campaign bid, quoted an unnamed prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office and questioned whether you had ever prosecuted a murderer. Can you name any murderers that you've prosecuted?
I've been involved in murder investigations. Those were pre-indictment, so I'm not at liberty to talk about those. But I led the prosecution of over 100 federal felony cases when I was in that office. I think if you talk to the people who actually worked with me, my work was well regarded, and I'm proud of the results we were able to get, getting dangerous criminals off the street, prosecuting bank robberies, armed robberies, a lot of bad guys with guns, and I think my record stands for itself.
And certainly when campaigns start, those unnamed sources start to appear in print a little bit more frequently. I always encourage people to take that with a grain of salt. In your campaign speech, you also labeled yourself a true conservative warrior. Those were your words. And you said this, quote, "There are a lot of Republicans in Missouri, but few true conservatives." Do you consider Andrew Bailey a true conservative?
I think Andrew Bailey's new to his office. I think Andrew Bailey has spent most of his career in Jefferson City. And when we get around the state and when we talk to people from all walks of life, from all different parts of Missouri, there's deep, deep dissatisfaction with the kind of leadership they've been getting out of Jefferson City. This has been a red state for a long time, but we don't look like and we haven't been getting the same results as other red states like Florida or Texas or even Tennessee or Indiana. And what we hear when we talk to real voters is a desire for change in Jefferson City. And as a conservative outsider, as someone who hasn't run for office before, that's the message that our campaign is trying to push.
Some observers notice a bit of a split in the Missouri GOP right now over what priorities to focus on first and foremost. The agenda. Some want to see a focus on crime and public safety be preeminent. It might roll education into a top spot there. And others want to focus more on social issues around race and sex and gender. Which approach do you think is more appropriate?
I think we need an all of the above approach, and I don't see why solving Missouri's crime problems have to be at the exclusion of solving the deep issues we have with education, both at the K through 12 level and in higher education as well. So I think that's a false choice and a false dichotomy.
Well, it might be a choice that was made already. There seemed to be a shift around inauguration season in January, a few months back, when the former Attorney General took his helm as the new U.S. Senator and the new Attorney General came in. Suddenly, it was the state auditor that was now taking up the mantle or picking up the baton from Eric Schmidt, and the auditor was saying he's going to go after school districts for teaching things that he felt uncomfortable with, whether this was race and gender, whether it was sex and gender rather, or race and culture, those kinds of topics. He wanted to all of a sudden scrutinize school districts, and the AG's office no longer is pursuing those lawsuits. Would you pursue lawsuits like that at school districts?
I think we need an education system in this state that's focused on the needs and concerns of parents and students, not districts and school administrators. And as we've gotten around the state, we've heard complaints from many parents who are deeply concerned with what's being taught in their schools and the sort of agenda that's being pushed down on their children. I think that's absolutely something the Attorney General's office needs to focus on. And I'm glad that Scott Fitzpatrick, our new state auditor, seems laser focused on those issues as well.
Parents do have a pressure release valve at the school board, at the local school board, and there are mechanisms for that. I think the question about priorities is, does it reach the Attorney General's office and land on your desk? You've suggested that it might in some of your public posts, where you said that CRT, critical race theory, should be shut down. And you also called it in a different tweet, an earlier tweet, that critical race theory was a, quote, deeply evil way of viewing the world. I've heard the authors of critical race theory describe it as generally acknowledging the obstacles in our country's history that Black Americans faced, and then, two, watching how they've compounded or grown over time, and then and two, looking for ways to remove those obstacles and repair the harm that they've created. What's wrong with that?
I think that's a totally false definition of critical race theory.
How do you define
and I'd push back on that. Critical race theory is the idea that the institutions that define American life and American society in general are all based on racism. That racism is at the heart of the American experiment, that racism is at the heart of American culture and American society. And I just think that's completely wrong. I think the beauty of America in our founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution, is the opposite of that, that this is a country where everybody is supposed to be viewed on their own merits. This is a country where everybody is supposed to be viewed as individuals and where individuals have rights. Critical race theory is about elevating the group interests against group interests and elevating basically racial strife above individual rights. And I think that's deeply at odds with American principles and with the theory that underlies the entire American experiment. And I'll fight against critical race theory every day.
Well, I want to zero in on the last part of what you said about gathering groups and alluding to that. Martin Luther King spoke heavily about building political power, and said that minorities, by definition, could not on their own advance policy interest of theirs because they needed allies, white people, to build a political coalition with them to help advance civil rights. That's coalition building.
Martin Luther King Jr. also said that he dreamed of a world where his children would be viewed on the basis of the content of their character and not the color of their skin, where all children would be. That's the world I think we need to be building towards. What critical race theory does is sets group against group, sets race against race, and I think that's the opposite of what we should be teaching in our schools. And I think it's insane that in a red state like Missouri, you have out of control, woke bureaucrats and school districts all over the state who view this as their mission, who view separating children, setting them against each other as the most important thing they can be doing. And as parents have gotten more involved in schools in the aftermath of COVID, when they started learning more about what was being taught in their schools, I think there's been a real grassroots movement against this. And that's why you're seeing so many contested school board elections all over the state. That's why you're seeing so much strife at that level. It's because of this this crazy agenda that seeped into our schools.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps we'll hear more and see more of a distinction between you and Attorney General Andrew Bailey as this primary unravels on these issues around education generally. I want to shift to a rather somber topic before we let you go, because I know your career resume includes a lot of focus on crime and violence. There was a sad story earlier this week. A Missouri police officer shot and killed. Detective Sergeant Mason Griffith was killed trying to serve an arrest warrant. You made a political point in paying respects to him, but also adding this tweet. You said, quote, "When the woke left talks about bail reform, all too often they're talking about letting more dangerous criminals like this guy accused of killing a police officer stay on the streets." You said we need to ask why he was out on the streets at all. Let me ask you this policy question. I don't know that you would get a vote on it in the legislature, but an attorney general might address or confront this issue should it come up. Across the border in Illinois, they just did away with money bond. And they said, we're no longer going to allow people accused of violent gun crimes, like these 3 former gun charges he had, buy their way out. This guy had bond, and he bought his way out. Illinois said, we're going to do away with that. We're going to make a system where if you're accused of a violent crime, you're going to sit in jail and wait until your trial. If you're accused of a non-violent crime, drug charge or some other lower charge, you're going to be allowed to go out until your actual trial. And then if you're guilty, you'll go to prison. Could a system like that make Missouri safer?
There's a view on the woke left, or among the woke left, that nobody should be held in jail pending charges. I think that view is deeply wrong.
Not violent people.
What we saw in this case with Detective Griffith was a man who'd been charged in 2017 with, I believe, 4 firearms felony charges and 1 felony drug charge. He was released on bond. He then proceeded to rack up, I believe, 4 more federal cases while he was out on release, and yet his bail was never revoked. To me, that's a damning indictment of the system, and it's unfortunate that it ended in the tragedy that it ended in. But when I was prosecuting violent criminals here in the St. Louis region, if we had someone with a record, if we had someone who was accused of dangerous felonies involving guns, felonies involving robbery, bank robbery, we always moved to detain pretrial, and more often than not, we were successful. I think we need prosecutors who are willing to put in the work to get these guys off the streets, and I think we need judges who are willing to think about community safety when they make these potentially life-altering decisions.
All right, I'd love to keep going. We have to leave it there. Will Scharf, thank you for joining us. There's been a lot of talk about woke as it relates to banks this week, too. Many people were watching on Wall Street and around the country as confidence in the American banking system started to shudder a bit. U.S. regulators pledged to cover all of the deposits in 2 major failed banks, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, on the money that they had there, so the companies that were holding their accounts could still make payroll this week. Senator Josh Hawley says that Congress should ban those banks around the country, banks that have to pay higher insurance fees, from passing fees on to other customers. He also says that smaller community banks should not have to kick in those higher insurance fees. Hawley also told us earlier this afternoon that he would prefer to bring back a firewall in federal law that separates community banks from investment banks. Take a listen.
I think we need to bring back the division between commercial banks, community banks on the one hand, and investment banks, sometimes referred to as Glass-Steagall. That was the law in this country from the Depression until the 1990s. And then in the late 1990s, President Clinton and Congress repealed it. Huge mistake. I think that's led to the nationalization of banks. I think it's led to the decimation of community banks. And I'd like to see that legislation, that wall, brought back.
Senator Elizabeth Warren has also called for similar regulations that separate big investor banks from smaller community banks. Both senators are calling for Congress to claw back bonuses paid to executives right before the government seized the failed bank. Hawley's proposal also appears to have some support from the newest House Democrat from this region, Illinois House Democrat Nikki Budzinski. We talked to her yesterday.
But do you have any concern that banks might pass these assessment fees on to customers in the Midwest?
I'm very concerned about that. I also think that we need to make sure that taxpayers are not footing the bill for what happened at these banks. I think that the administration, and why I applauded them, is they reacted quickly and swiftly. We have to do that because our markets are also reacting to what they're seeing is happening. We don't want to have other banks falling into these same situations. I think we need to be looking in Congress for more transparency as to what exactly happened. I think we need to look back into what some of the efforts that could have deregulated some of the banking industry in the previous administration, that could have seeded why the situation happened in the first place.
And we could have seen some more of those details on Capitol Hill today as U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen just got done testifying for about 3 hours before Congress. Let's switch gears back to Jefferson City now. We're kind of hitting to all fields, spraying to all fields today. House Democrat LaKeySha Bosley is now on the record. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, Mark.
It's your week off.
It is.
So we're glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us. Do you want to respond at all to what you were just sitting off camera there? Could you hear much of the conversation about Kim Gardner? Do you see willful neglect in her office?
I do not. See, the problem is you have to prove intent of neglect, and the proof is not there. Circuit Attorney Gardner has done all that she can in light of the situation. You know, it's a tragedy of what happened to the young lady's family. But if we are talking about the process within itself, the process is it's up to the judge to dismiss bail or let a person out on bail or bond. It's not up to the circuit attorney. And then I know that there were multiple different organizations that came out, including the defense attorney of the gentleman, who said that that was something that they requested, that bail not be denied.
The defense attorney actually said she only asked for that one time. She's claiming she's asked for it 3 separate times, and there's no court record that ever says she did.
Those are oral arguments, and you know, oral arguments are a little bit different. So sometimes
the transcript includes no reference of it.
So I mean, the fact is she did ask, and we have to, you know, be very cognitive of pointing blame if we don't know what the full process is.
But the question is whether they can meet the bar of willful intent. This very well may turn out to be, if they can't prove that, an effective method, frankly, for Republicans to put her record under the microscope in a very public setting.
I mean, if we're talking about willful intent, let's talk about, you know, the prosecutor who didn't prosecute in the Agape boarding school situation. If we want to go after somebody after we've constantly had the conversations about it, then that's a person that we should be filing a suit against for willful neglect.
For those in our audience who may not know, that school has now been closed and shuttered.
Closed.
It was in Southwest Missouri, I believe, and some troubled teens from across the country, parents would sometimes send them to this religious boarding school where some of them were abused, and there are some pretty horrific allegations there.
Yeah.
Sounds like you'd like to see a different set of focus or priorities from the AG's office.
I mean, look, if we're going to go after people for willful neglect and prosecutor situations, then this is something that we should definitely be looking into.
You have a bill right now before the Missouri House that would raise the bar or make a wider path for people like Lamar Johnson, wrongly convicted, who served nearly 3 decades in jail, to seek damages from the state.
Yeah.
I read through your bill. Correct me if I missed it. Is there a cap on the damages they could seek from the state?
So from the state, it has the $65,000 payout a year, but it allows them to be able to seek in court their due justice. So say, for instance, if you want to file a civil suit, they can do that. It doesn't limit them from being able to file a civil suit while they're still receiving restitution. And that's where the confusion comes in a lot. It's like an offset. So if you're receiving funds from the restitution fund, and you file a civil suit, whatever that award may be from the judge, if it's $1 million plus or whatnot, that'll be an offset from whatever you've received from that restitution fund.
I see. So there could be 2 pots of money that people in Lamar Johnson's situation could draw from.
No, it's only 1 pot of money.
Okay.
So it's an offset. So if you draw, say for instance, you've put in your request for restitution because you were wrongfully convicted and exonerated, you can still receive that $65,000 a year. And then from there, if you decide or your attorneys decide, hey, we want to go and file suit, we want to do a civil suit, from that civil suit, if the judge awards you a certain amount, from whatever you've already been paid out that's going to be subtracted from that awarded amount.
You sit on a committee in the House in Missouri where just before the break there was a bill discussed, and it hasn't been voted on yet. It hasn't been passed out of the House over to the Senate. But it would basically, as I read the bill, ban discussions around diversity, equity, or inclusion in medical schools specifically. This DEI conversation is suddenly some sort of a political hot button or buzzword. Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis has stressed it.
Yes.
Do you see a shift in the Republican Party on this topic?
Let's be clear. Diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't just mean race or color. It could be socioeconomic backgrounds. It could be from rural or urban areas. It could be a multitude of things. So it's very interesting to me that we're having a conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we're not looking at it on a larger scale. You know, it bothers me that we're having the conversation solely around race, and we're not talking about the different forms of diversity. Sitting on that committee, you had one of my colleagues, it wasn't explicitly what he said, but he alluded to that majority of the kids and people who are applying or accepted into medical school were from the urban area or were minorities. And with them being minorities, only a certain percentage was rural. And it bothers me because what you're saying is that African Americans or minority groups can't be from rural Missouri, and that's simply not true.
I suppose there are statistics and odds. People might paint with a broad brush, and perhaps that was, I didn't hear that part of the exchange. But,
yeah.
What is the benefit, or do you see a First Amendment issue here too with taking higher ed or in medical schools where students are learning how to, address inequities in the medical outcomes that they see as patients present to the clinic? We know from the data that people of color, patients of color, often have higher risk rates, worse outcomes due to a host of underlying issues. But should medical students be allowed to explore what contributes to those outcomes? I mean,
absolutely. If you want to be a well-rounded doctor, a great doctor, and a great healthcare professional, you want to be able to treat all of your patients adequately and equally, right? And if you don't have the understanding or the knowledge of certain backgrounds in certain communities, then you're not going to be able to do your job the way that you intend to do your job. And I think that they're missing the point in the bill when we're talking about poor rural Missourians. They don't have access to adequate health care. The same in North St. Louis. It is essential that we have our doctors and our healthcare professionals and healthcare providers be able to understand what is happening in those communities, to be able to treat somebody holistically. You know, environment has a lot to do with it. Food, resources, and access have a lot to do with it. So if you have somebody saying, look, we don't want them to learn diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's also saying that we don't want our doctors to treat you for not access to food, no access to healthy air, and how can they actually treat that? I don't know if you know about the show House or not. I'm showing my nerd side by saying this.
With the doctor?
Yeah, Dr. House. So the show House, he was
carries a cane, I think.
He carried a cane. He was a doctor who treated very rare illnesses. And one thing about it is he couldn't treat all of the illnesses just by looking at the symptoms. He had to dive into the person's life. He had to go into their home and possibly treat in those ways to see if they had mold in the vents, if they had these things. This just goes back to understanding that you need to be inside of a person's community, know more about them before you can treat them properly.
I think Robin Williams and Patch Adams had a similar message. I'm afraid we're running out of time, though.
Okay.
I'd love to keep the conversation going, but thank you for joining us. Next week on The Record, Mayor Tashara Jones, Senator Bill Eigel, perhaps a few others from Illinois and Missouri politics. Until then, we're off the record.